Imagine a moment in history when a mighty emperor who had conquered the legendary Constantinople suddenly turned and fled after seeing the work of an enemy. It was not a mighty army, not artillery or a fortified citadel, but a deadly forest made up of 20,000 corpses impaled on stakes, including his own generals. The stench of thousands of corpses made seasoned warriors vomit on the spot. This was not a scene from a horror movie, but a historical fact about a real person, a real ruler, and a name that 15th century Europe trembled at the mention of. The story of Vlad III Dracula is not just a bloody page from the distant past, but a profound lesson in how absolute power can turn men into monsters. In our time, when dictators still exist, and violence is still a political tool, understanding Vlad Dracula is not only historical but also a warning for the present. This is the story of a wounded child who became the most evil man in European history, of how victims can become perpetrators more brutal than their tormentors. To understand Vlad's brutality, we must place him in the historical context of the 15th century. This was a time when the Ottoman Empire was expanding rapidly, westward, swallowing up Christian kingdoms one by one. Constantinople, which had stood as a symbol of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, finally fell in 1453 to Sultan Mehmed II. The situation created a fierce clash of civilizations and religions where small principalities like Wallachia were forced to constantly choose between survival and principle. Wallachia, the land where Vlad was born and ruled, was in a particularly delicate position, a buffer zone between the Christian and Muslim worlds. This meant that any ruler there faced a dire choice: submit to the Ottomans and survive, or resist and risk being completely annihilated. In this context, the use of extreme measures by a ruler to maintain power can be understood as a natural response to the struggle for survival. What set Vlad apart, however, was not his choice of violence as a political tool, which was quite common in that brutal era, but rather his use of violence as a horrifying art, a personal pleasure, and a means of satisfying his own psychologically sick impulses. This is where we must distinguish between a brutal yet human ruler and a complete psychopath. In 1431, in Sighisoara, Transylvania, Vlad was born into a noble family with a legacy both glorious and tragic. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military organization founded to resist Ottoman encroachment. The word Dracula means dragon in Romanian, and so Dracula means son of the dragon. However, the word could also be interpreted as son of the devil, a fateful coincidence that history would prove to be extremely accurate. Vlad's tragedy began as a young boy of 11. In 1442, Sultan Murad II invited Vlad Dracula to a diplomatic meeting, but it was a trap. Dracula was forced to bring along his two youngest sons, 11-year-old Vlad and 7-year-old Radu, as a sign of goodwill. Upon entering Ottoman territory, the entire family was captured. The Sultan was given a dire choice: leave his sons as hostages to ensure their loyalty, or watch them be executed on the spot. Vlad Dracula's decision in this moment not only shaped the future of his country, but also created a monster. He chose his own freedom over the lives of his children, riding off on horseback, leaving the two children in the hands of their enemies. For young Vlad, this was the ultimate moment of childhood, the moment he realized that even his father, the most trusted person in the world, could betray him for personal gain. The differences in how the two brothers responded to this situation are remarkable and can help us understand Vlad's psychological development. Radu, the handsome and charming younger brother, adapted well to life at the Ottoman court. He learned Turkish, converted to Islam, and became one of the Sultan's favorite leaders. There are rumors that the relationship between Radu and the Sultan went beyond the usual teacher-student relationship. But regardless, he found a way to not only survive, but also thrive in a hostile environment. Vlad, on the other hand, refused to submit completely. He cursed his Turkish tutors refused to learn the Quran and attacked other hostages when they insulted Christianity. This stubbornness cost him dearly. The Turks had special methods for disciplining stubborn children, Filika, beating the soles of the feet until they cracked bastinado, hanging upside down, and hitting the body with sticks, starvation, isolation, and darkness. The most brutal thing Vlad endured, however, was not the physical punishment, but being forced to witness Ottoman executions, especially impalement at the stake. The Turks used this method for particular enemies, those who deserved not only death, but also days of public agony. The 12-year-old was educated in how to carry out this punishment artfully. The stake had to be blunt, not pointed to avoid puncturing vital organs too quickly. The angle had to be just right, so that the stake would travel along the spine and exit through the shoulders or mouth, keeping the victim alive for days. The terrible thing is that these brutal lessons did not destroy Vlad, but rather shaped him. Every blow, every humiliation, every witness to the impalement became a lesson in power, in how to inflict fear, in how to turn pain into a tool of control. Unlike other victims of childhood trauma, Vlad did not become withdrawn or suicidal, but instead became a collector of the knowledge of suffering. The situation in Wallachia, while Vlad was in captivity, added to the cruelty of the situation. His father, Vlad Dracula, tried to play all sides, Christian, Ottoman, Hungarian, to retain the throne. This strategy ultimately failed miserably. In 1447, Wallachian nobles allied with the Hungarian regent John Hunyadi, ambushed and killed Vlad Dracula in the marshes near Balteni. They dismembered him, but reserved a special piece for Mircea Vlad's eldest brother. The boyars, Wallachian nobles, captured Mircea, first blinding him with a red-hot iron. Then, while he was still screaming in pain, still alive, they buried him alive. The man, who was supposed to be Vlad's protector, died in despair, clawing at the earth above him to escape suffocation. When news of this reached the Ottoman court, 16-year-old Vlad took it with strange calm. His guards expected tears rage or some kind of reaction. Instead, he simply asked, "How long will it take for my brother to die underground?" The Ottomans did not realize that they were looking at a creature of their own making. 6 years of torture had not broken Vlad, but transformed him. Each blow, each humiliation, each forced witness to the impalement of a stake had taught him not how to submit, but how to inflict suffering. The Ottomans decided that Vlad could be useful, and released him with a small force to reclaim his father's throne. His first reign lasted only 2 months before he was defeated, but those 2 months gave us a preview of what was to come. Even then, the 17-year-old Vlad showed unusual cruelty. When a merchant complained about theft, Vlad had the suspect's legs skinned and the raw flesh rubbed with salt. But this was just practice. The real horror was yet to come. For the next 8 years, Vlad served in various armies, learning the art of war. Remarkably, he even fought alongside John Hunyadi, the man who killed his father, because revenge can wait, but knowledge cannot. This was the first sign of Vlad's cold and calculating intellect. He was not a maniac driven by emotion, but a patient strategist, willing to learn from his enemies in order to prepare for a more perfect revenge. During this time, Vlad studied defense cavalry tactics and, most importantly, psychological warfare. He built a network of supporters who shared his hatred of both the Ottomans and the traitorous boyars. This preparation showed that Vlad was not just a random brutalizer, but a planner, one who understood that cruelty had to be organized and systematized for maximum effect. Vlad's moment came with the support of Hungary, and he invaded Wallachia again. The current ruler, Vladislav II, faced him in a duel. According to legend, Vlad not only killed him but also slowly beheaded him, cutting through his neck while Vladislav was still alive. This was not a murder in anger, but a symbolic act, a message to all who would dare oppose him. Easter Sunday, 1457, marked a turning point in the history of Wallachia and in Vlad's soul. He invited hundreds of boyar families to a banquet at his palace in Targovishte. These were the men who had betrayed his father and buried his brother alive. They came in their finest clothes, believing that the new prince wanted peace. The feast was wonderful. The wine flowed like water. The music was loud, and the atmosphere seemed relaxed. Then Vlad stood up and asked a simple question. "In your lifetime, how many princes have you seen rule Wallachia?" The drunken and honest boyars gave various answers. Some said 5, others said 20, and a few of the older nobles admitted to serving 30 different princes. Each admission was a confession. They had survived by switching sides, by betraying each ruler when it was convenient. Vlad nodded thoughtfully, then gave a signal. Soldiers rushed in from every door. Within minutes, hundreds of boyars were in chains. Vlad ordered the old and weak impaled on the spot in the courtyard visible from the banquet hall. The screaming began immediately, but for the young and strong he had other plans. Still dressed in their festive attire, they were marched north to a ruined castle. For months they were forced to rebuild Poenari Castle, stone by stone. They worked until their fine clothes were torn from their bodies, then worked naked. Whenever they collapsed, they were impaled on stakes. This was just the beginning. I have discovered documents that show what happened next was shocking, even by medieval standards of cruelty. Vlad not only punished his enemies, but also began to enjoy the process of punishment. He would walk among the dying, adjusting the position of the corpses that had slid down, noting which angle of the impalement lasted the longest. From a modern psychological perspective, we can see that this was the moment when Vlad crossed the line from a brutal ruler to a full-blown psychopath. Punishment ceased to be a means to political ends and became an end in itself. The suffering of others became a source of personal pleasure for him, a clear sign of antisocial personality disorder with extreme violent tendencies. In 1459, the Saxon trading town of Brasov became the scene of one of Vlad's most gruesome crimes. The city was hiding Vlad's enemies and rival candidates for the throne. Vlad sent out a warning. The city ignored it. So Vlad brought 20,000 soldiers and showed them what happens when you ignore the dragon. He not only attacked the city, he turned it into a gallery of horrors. The black church Biserica Neagra got its name from the fires Vlad set, but the fire was merciful compared to what else he did. Men, women, children, all were impaled in neat rows. Newborns were impaled on the same stakes as their mothers placed at their breasts, as if nursing. Pregnant women had stakes driven through their wombs. But this is what separates Vlad from the average sadist. He sets a table in the middle of this forest of dying people. Servants bring him a full meal, roasted meat, fresh bread, wine. Vlad sits and eats, surrounded by thousands of people in various stages of death. Groans, screams, pleas. That is the soundtrack to his dinner. One of his boyars couldn't stand it. The man covered his nose against the stench of blood and feces. Vlad noticed. "Does it smell bad to you?" he asked pleasantly. The boyar admitted it did. Vlad impaled him on a stake twice as high as the others. "You'll be above the smell up there," he explained. Medieval chronicles record something else about this meal, something so gruesome that most historians ignore it. According to both German and Russian sources, Vlad dipped bread in the blood that pooled beneath the stakes. He developed a taste for it. Blood-soaked bread became his favorite meal during mass executions. From a psychological perspective, this behavior reveals a profound level of moral degeneration. Eating in the face of death and suffering not only shows a lack of empathy, but also a complete reversal of basic human values. Vlad is not only unaffected by suffering, but is literally nourished by it. The numbers alone are staggering. Conservative estimates put Vlad's death toll at 40,000, others say 80,000. But in a principality of just 500,000 people, he may have killed 20% of its population. That would be a higher rate than Stalin or Pol Pot. But, unlike those dictators, Vlad did not delegate. He personally oversaw, he innovated. Basic impalement was not enough for Vlad. He developed variations, stakes through the mouth for liars, through the skull for thieves driven in slowly with a hammer to prolong the victim's life. Women guilty of adultery had stakes driven through their vaginas emerging through their mouths. He impaled people upside down sideways in patterns that spelled out messages. This brutal innovation shows that Vlad was not just a killer, but an artist of suffering. He studied human anatomy, not to heal, but to prolong suffering. He understood psychology not to help, but to maximize terror. This is the difference between random violence and systematic violence, between cruelty and the art of cruelty. In historical context, we can compare Vlad to other dictators to understand how unusual he was. While most brutal rulers used violence as a tool to maintain power, Vlad turned violence into an artistic expression of evil. The difference is not just one of degree, but of kind, between killing to rule and ruling to kill. Two events pushed Vlad from a brutal ruler into a full-blown monster. First, he remarried. The name of his first wife is lost to history, but we know he had to secure his succession. Second, Sultan Mehmed II demanded tribute, not just gold, but 500 boys for the Janissary Corps who would be converted to Islam and trained as soldiers. Vlad's response was characteristic: "Come and take them yourself." When Ottoman emissaries came to collect taxes, they refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious custom. Vlad congratulated them on their piety, then nailed their turbans to their skulls with 3-inch iron nails. They were sent back to Constantinople alive, still wearing the sacred turbans that were now permanently attached. The Sultan sent an army led by Hamza Pasha. Vlad ambushed them at night, capturing thousands. Each prisoner was impaled, but for Hamza Pasha, Vlad prepared something special. The general was castrated. First, his genitals were stuffed into his mouth, and then he was impaled on a gilded stake, because even in torture rank must be respected. This brings us to 1462, and the event that would cement Vlad's reputation forever. Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, after taking Constantinople personally, led an army of 150,000 men into Wallachia. Some sources say 300,000. Vlad may have had 30,000, including old men and boys. He could not win in a direct fight, so he did not fight directly. When the Ottomans advanced, they found a wasteland. Vlad had burned every field poisoned, every well evacuated, every village. The Turks marched through ash and silence. But that wasn't the worst part. Vlad sent diseased prostitutes into the Ottoman camps. Men infected with the plague infiltrated their ranks. The mighty Ottoman army began to die before any battle could be fought. On June 17, 1462, attacking at night with a small force of his best cavalry, Vlad infiltrated the Ottoman camp under the cover of darkness. The goal to assassinate Mehmed in his tent and end the invasion in one blow. Vlad personally led the attack, cutting through the guards searching for the Sultan's tent. But in the darkness and confusion, they hit the wrong tent. Instead of Mehmed, they found the Grand Vizier. The assassination attempt failed, and Vlad and his men barely escaped as the entire Ottoman camp mobilized. The next day, Mehmed continued towards Targovishte, Vlad's capital. The gates were open. There were no guards on the walls. The Sultan suspected a trap and advanced cautiously. Then they saw it. Before I describe the most horrifying sight in military history, you need to understand the scale. For miles around the city, covering 7 acres, stood wooden stakes, 20,000 of them, and on each stake a human being in various stages of death and decomposition. Men, women, children. Turks captured in previous battles. Muslim Bulgarians who had supported the Ottomans. Traitors to Wallachia. Some had been dead for weeks, their bodies black with decay. Crows pecking at exposed flesh. Others impaled more recently, still moved, still groaned. The geometry was deliberate. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles, like an eerie garden. The tallest stakes in the center held the highest-ranking victims. Hamza Pasha's golden stake gleamed in the middle, his body long dead but still clad in ceremonial armor. The stench made seasoned soldiers vomit. The sight made them cry. These were men who had conquered cities, who had seen the Byzantine Constantinople fall. But this was beyond war. This was madness incarnate. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who ended the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, looked at this dead forest and spoke words that would echo through history. I cannot take the land of a man who does such things. What can one do against such a devil? He turned his army. The man who never retreated, retreated. But here's the really disturbing part. Vlad considered this his masterpiece. While Mehmed fled, Vlad walked between the stakes like an artist in his gallery. He adjusted the bodies that had slipped. He noted which angle of the stake hit the longest. This wasn't just psychological warfare. This was fun. A captured Turkish chronicle often omitted from sanitized history's records that Vlad would visit the stake fields alone at night. He would sit among the dying and listen to their groans as if they were music. He would touch the stakes to feel the vibrations of their struggling bodies. He would bring wine and toast the dying. This was the real Vlad, not a patriot defending Christianity. Not a harsh but necessary ruler, but a man who found joy in human suffering, stretched to its absolute limits. The Ottomans left, but they left Vlad's younger brother Radu with the army. Remember the beautiful Radu, who had thrived in Ottoman captivity. He offered the Wallachians a choice: support him and live in peace, or stick with the madman. It was not a difficult choice. Vlad's own nobles abandoned him. His army disintegrated. By August 1462, he was fleeing to Hungary to seek help from King Matthias Corvinus. But Matthias had made contact with the Ottomans. When Vlad arrived, he was arrested and imprisoned for 12 years. He rotted in a Hungarian prison, but even in prison, the disease persisted. Guards reported finding dead rats carefully impaled on broken pieces of wood in Vlad's cell. Small birds were impaled on sharpened feathers. He created miniature impalement fields with insects pinned to pieces of wood. When asked why, he simply said he didn't want to lose his skills. Think about it. 12 years in a cell, and his main concern was maintaining his technique of torturing living creatures. The guards were so confused that they stopped bringing him anything that could be sharpened. Politics changed. Hungary needed allies against the Ottomans again. Vlad was released and even given a Hungarian noble bride. He converted to Catholicism, a political move, and was given an army to reclaim Wallachia. His third reign began in 1476. He was older now, in his 40s, but the cruelty did not age. If anything, captivity had fermented it into something worse. The impaling continued immediately, but now he added psychological torture. He forced families to watch each other impaled, in order children first, then mothers, then fathers. One story from this period is so gruesome that even contemporary chroniclers hesitate to record it. A group of Turkish prisoners were brought before Vlad. He impaled them in a particular pattern, shorter stakes in front, taller ones in back, creating a theater of suffering. In the center, he impaled a pregnant woman vertically. As she died for hours, she gave birth on the stake. The baby, of course, died instantly. Vlad watched the entire process, taking notes on how long each stage took. This is not war. This is not even madness. This is evil so pure that it defies understanding. In December 14, Vlad was marching with a small force when he was ambushed by Ottoman troops. Details vary. Some say he was assassinated by his own men, tired of serving a monster. Others say the Turks overwhelmed him. What we do know is this: Vlad the Impaler died in battle, his head severed from his body. The Turks took his head to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed II displayed it on a stake above the city gates. There was poetry in it. The Impaler was eventually impaled, if only in death. His body was supposedly buried at the Snagov Monastery, but when archaeologists opened his supposed grave in 1931, they found it empty. Some say the monks, horrified at having endured such evil, moved the body. Others whispered darker theories. But Vlad's death doesn't end his story. You might think I'm about to talk about Bram Stoker and vampire lore. I'm not. Because the true horror of Vlad's legacy isn't fiction. It's reality. In Romania today, Vlad is considered a national hero. Yes, you heard that right. The man who murdered 80,000 people, who ate blood-soaked bread while watching children die at stake, who impaled newborn babies on their mothers' chests. This man has a monument. His face is on tourist merchandise. Romanian nationalists hail him as a defender of Christianity, a bulwark against Muslim encroachment. They focus on his resistance to the Ottomans and ignore the screaming forests of the dead. They celebrate his harsh justice. He is said to have made Wallachia so safe that a golden cup could be left in a public fountain without being stolen. They fail to mention that safety came from a terror so absolute that everyone was afraid to breathe the wrong breath. From a modern psychological perspective, the case of Vlad Dracula is a classic example of how childhood trauma can create a violent psychopath. His years of captivity at the Ottoman court not only caused psychological damage, but also educated him in the art of inflicting pain. This created a terrifying psychological spiral. The victim became the perpetrator, and the perpetrator was in turn more brutal than the original tormentor. Psychologists studying historical records classify Vlad as a violent psychopath with possible sexual dysfunction. Many of his specific stabbing methods targeted the genitals. They note his childhood trauma, his forced observation of torture, his helplessness as a hostage, classic serial killer development. Except this serial killer had an army and a country. Perhaps the most chilling details, however, come from those who knew him personally. They describe a man who was cultured, intelligent, even charming when he chose. He spoke many languages, wrote poetry, understood theology and philosophy. He was not a mindless brute. He was worse, a brilliant mind who chose to use his gifts to inflict the most exquisite suffering possible. Russian chronicles describe foreign merchants visiting Vlad's court. He treated them well, showed them hospitality. Then, as they left, he casually mentioned that he had impaled their servants while they were dining just to see if they would notice. They didn't. He laughed and left them to discover the bodies on the way out. This is what real evil looks like. Not screaming madness, but calm, calculated cruelty delivered with a smile. In the modern world, the story of Vlad Dracula is especially relevant. We live in an age where dictators still exist, where concentrated power can have catastrophic consequences, and where collective trauma can create persistent cycles of violence. Vlad's story shows that justifying violence based on political or religious goals is extremely dangerous. When we accept that the ends justify the means, we open the door to people like Vlad, people who will use any excuse to satisfy their sadistic impulses. The most terrifying thing about Vlad is not that he killed so many people, but that he enjoyed doing it. This reminds us that in every society there are always individuals who have the potential to become monsters if given absolute power. Therefore, it is extremely important to build systems that check power, protect human rights, and maintain humane values. Vlad III. Dracula died in the winter of 1406, his head displayed on a Turkish stake. But his legacy that humans can surpass any fictional monster in cruelty lives on forever. Every dictator who wields terror, every murderer who finds pleasure in pain, every traumatized child who grows up to inflict trauma on others, all are children of Vlad the Impaler, the man who created hell on earth and called it justice. What's truly terrifying about this story isn't that a monster ever existed, but that we still find ways to turn monsters into heroes. We focus on their triumphs and ignore their victims. We pretend that their ends justify their means. They don't. They never do. And until we stop making heroes out of monsters, we'll keep making more Vlads, more impaled forests, more proof that Dracula doesn't really need fangs, just power and a wounded soul. And that is perhaps the most terrifying lesson history can teach us, that real monsters come not from the supernatural world, but from the darkness within the human soul, when unleashed by absolute power and a lack of moral control.